Дорогі колеги, ми будемо починати.
Dear colleagues, we are going to begin. Please take your seats if you are not sitting yet. And please make sure that you have your headsets if you need them. So, dear esteemed guests, ministers, your excellencies, and dear participants, and our online audience, on behalf of the Center New Europe, let me welcome you at this already traditional annual event on foreign policy organized in the partnership with the Foreign Policy Ministry, Diplomacy 2020. At this event, we are attempting to somehow summarize the year that has expired, but also plan the foreign policy for the forthcoming year. And this year has been quite important in the foreign policy. Maybe for the first time in the history of independent Ukraine, we had foreign strategy. And today we have the minister, Dmytro Kuleba, who will personally present the key priorities of this strategy. As far as I know, there are 6 of them. And again, this is a good news because usually in Ukraine we would have 20 or 26. So this is a progressive thing that we have just 6. And also the Center New Europe likes to have evidence-based foreign policy, so we will present our annual sociological survey on the expectations in the Ukrainian society in this context of foreign policy. And then in the 2 panel discussions we will hear about the security diplomacy, which is crucial for Ukraine in these times of the permanent threat. And we will be having the discussions on the strategy and on the results of the survey, to which extent are they in line with each other, and this also will be a subject for discussion. Here I'm giving the floor to the minister, not only for the welcoming word, but also for the presentation of the strategy of the foreign activity of Ukraine. Thank you, Elena. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I will do my best not to speak for too long and not to be too formal in my remarks, but rather present the result of this year. And we are already approaching the end of 2021, and also the commemorating the Diplomacy Day. I would use this opportunity to summarize the accomplishments not only in the political sense, but also in the evidence-based manner, as we have heard, based on the data obtained from Novaya Europa, to look into the forthcoming year as well. This year we had lots of work, and we also had lots of accomplishments. The main thing here, in my opinion, is that we have approved for the first time in 30 years of Ukraine's independence the comprehensive foreign strategy of Ukraine. This is important because the strategy is the way of structuring thinking with a worldview, and most importantly, the actions for the protection and advancing of the national interests of Ukraine. In this strategy, we have included the long-term government policy for the peace, security and well-being of Ukrainians, and asserting Ukraine as an active player in the international politics. That's a real tool, let me emphasize this, not just a declaration of intentions. And proving such a strategy is not a simple thing, because if it was, we would have had it before us. But now we have an even more important task: to learn to follow this strategy, because as you probably know, there are many strategies that are being approved in our country, but following the strategies is something that's difficult to accomplish. So we are being ambitious here. We are attempting to establish this culture of the diplomacy service following the strategic framework. And this is a task that our president, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, has set before us, because the intention is for the Ukrainian diplomacy to work in a systematic and result-oriented way. Today I will present the key priorities of the strategy that we were implementing this year and are going to continue implementing the next year. The strategy is departing from the multi-vector and partner-dependent or even the inferiority culture that Ukraine has before, and all the other obstacles for the growth of the country, which we unfortunately had after gaining the independence. Unfortunately, the center for our decision making was for a long time being outside of Ukraine. For many years it was in Moscow. Some people see it in Brussels, in Washington, in Warsaw, depends on your political preferences. These are very important partners, all the countries except the Russian Federation, and we are going to develop with them genuine partnership and friendship. But the strategy moves the center for decision making back to Kiev. We know where Ukraine is moving. We have the trust of the nation to this path, and we have the strategic document outlining how to use resources and where to direct our efforts. We have defined only 6 priorities, and this was indeed very difficult, and everyone who has worked on this knows that focusing is very difficult. So we have defined the priorities, such as ensuring the sovereignty and integrity of Ukraine's territory, then counteracting the Russian aggression, and also seeking legal responsibility of Russia for its crimes against Ukraine. The third priority is continuing our path to the full membership in the EU and NATO. Priority 4, promoting Ukrainian exports and inviting foreign investments. The 5th is the protection of the interests of Ukrainians abroad. And 6, ensuring the positive image of Ukraine in the world. So these are the 6 priorities or pillars we are going to base our work upon, and the strategy will enable the introduction of concerted efforts, and of course some urgent things may emerge, but we will have some focus before our diplomats. And our intention is to promote influential and strong Ukraine, which not only requests support, but also provides support. And the country that is ready to provide and implement solutions for the support of others. And we want this policy to be set in stone, no matter who is having the power, whether it's the opposition or anyone else, whatever the name of the minister is, whatever the economic or political situation is. And the strategy ensures following this national path without any turbulence in case of there are any external political events. This is at least the goal we have set before us. So, the first thing here, I would like to add three elements here. The main focus points that we are going to have when implementing this strategy. The first one is our internal motto, Ukraine as an active actor of foreign policy. Second, Ukraine ensuring the infrastructure of security, global and local. And the third, Ukraine opening new economic opportunities. So the first one of them is being implemented through multilateral diplomacy tools. Ukraine has a special sentiment towards international organizations because since 1945, when Ukraine endured huge losses in World War II, it was invited to become a member of the United Nations organizations, and the basis of the Ukrainian diplomacy was developed there. Right now it's time to rethink our tasks and to get to the new level. And in this regard, it was quite significant to point out in the President's remarks at the General Assembly, to point out that the President has mentioned the things others prefer not to notice or be silent about. And this democratic boldness to some extent played in our favor. We believe that this ability to be a step forward in the foreign policy is useful not only for Ukraine, but also for the international organizations themselves. I remember that the subject of UN reform was discussed in many theses of students' works since my student days, but still the reform is still stalled. And we need to be proactive in this because at some point these initiatives of reforming the UN will find a way forward. And one more important quality of our multilateral policy is establishing the Crimea platform, which also took place this year. I will go in more details on that later. The second area is our regional policy and the relations with our key international partners. We are satisfied with the fact that this year we managed to establish an associated trio with Georgia and Moldova. Last year we also established the triangle with Lithuania and Poland, and next week we are going to have the first summit of this Lublin triangle here in our country. The presidents will be visiting our country, and also we have established one more collaboration format with Turkey, where the ministers of foreign affairs and defense will be defining the next steps of collaboration in the security area. So this is a new old trend in the international relations. Unfortunately, big international organizations suffer from the antagonism of the key players, and quite recently I have been to the ministerial meeting of OSCE where this was obvious. Russia is blocking the key decisions, and it's not even ashamed of it. It's stalling the development and even functioning of this organization. Yesterday, the Russian Federation has blocked the inclusion, the issue of climate to the UN agenda, and this antagonism results in the big organizations losing its capabilities. I don't mean that they are not relevant anymore, but the governments are looking for the new formats, working in smaller circles to achieve certain ends, and we are following this trend. Also, you can notice that both the Lublin Triangle and the associated trio are the formats supporting our Euro integration to Euro-Atlantic course. We are doing this not because we want even closer relations with our close partners, but because we understand one simple truth, and we need to be direct about this. No one can protect organization, no one can protect Ukraine better than Ukraine can protect itself. So we have to be very pragmatic, and we need to strengthen the ties with the countries ready to support us and the countries we are ready to support if necessary. The Lublin Triangle, for instance, when Lithuania faced the first wave of attempts of Belarus to use migrants as a weapon on the border, Ukraine was one of the first countries that supported our friendly nation. I never could imagine that humanitarian support could be provided in the form of the barbed wire, but this actually was the case. And when the second wave has started and we could see all the terrible events at the border of Belarus and Poland, we realized that Lublin Triangle is the best mechanism for the coordination of actions and defining these joint efforts. And so in this Lublin Triangle, we realized that the things are being developed as political initiatives, but also as practical tools to strengthen each other and to advance security, and also for the development of the strategic partnership with Turkey, and for the political dialogue at the level of the heads of the countries, and also the development of relations with Turkey. So in the beginning of the next year, President Erdogan will be visiting Ukraine, and this is going to be the next step in the development of our relations. I hope it's quite obvious why it is so important to have such relations for the security of the Red Sea region, and for the promotion of security of Ukraine, and for the promotion of Ukraine's Crimea. So this is a very important factor of stability in this region of Mediterranean and Black Sea. We are going to strengthen our interaction with the Visegrad Group, and it's crucial that we will see a new government in the Czech Republic. Quite soon I'm going to have meetings with the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I believe that the central Europe is the key region for the development of the relations with Ukraine and promoting our interests. Yesterday I bought an interesting book about cuisine of the Hetman state. And on the one hand, it's a book about food, but on the other hand, it's also a book about the true situation of Ukraine before it was consumed by Russia. We were a part of Central and Western Europe, and it is obvious from the culture that existed here among the political elites of Ukraine and the food they ate and the wines they drank. So it was Hungarian wines and cheese from Western Europe and Mediterranean fish. So historically, even judging from this cuisine ties, we are a part of Central Europe, and this is where we need to come back. Therefore, it was important for me that this year I was invited to take part in the meetings of the Central Europe's coalition of 5 countries, and we had this conversation uniting Poland, Romania and Turkey, and we are interested in the Bucharest format of 9 countries, and this year we are also chairing in the Danube Commission, which is a part of our policy. And so Ukraine is the first country that is being a chair for the Danube region and coordinating strategic policies for the members of this strategy without being a member. And also the third area is protection from the Russian aggression. This is the most difficult one, but the most long-awaited in the Ukrainian nation. And it's quite understandable that you could see in some of our work over the last weeks and our political efforts, our practical efforts, we got this opportunity and we ensured that Ukraine joined the Europe's Peace Fund, which means that Ukraine's security sector is going to get 31 million euro, but it has some broader political context because this means the additional involvement of Ukraine in the mechanisms of the European Union, and while the door is still closed, we need to open more windows, and then we need to open all the windows. And this is true not only for the European Union but also for the NATO. And it's also a part of overcoming the Russian aggression, because we understand that the stronger Ukraine is, the better it is integrated with other NATO countries, the smaller the chances of Russia to destabilize and to ruin Ukraine. And also we are paying special attention to the policy of the occupation of the Crimea, and here we can speak of the historical success of the Crimean platform, because many international meetings started greeting us with the launch of this mechanism. It was not easy, but this is something we managed to do. And by the way, the greetings opened the first offline meeting of the presidents of Ukraine and the United States, which happened in the fall 2021. So this is the largest event of such kind in Ukraine's history. We had 46 high-level delegations. We are developing this platform. We are ensuring its inclusion in the system of international relations, and we had a side event. We had a political conference in Berlin, and there is also the resolution of UN General Assembly, which has a mention of the Crimean platform, and we are right now introducing the Crimean platform into the system of international relations. And as I could hear from my colleagues in other countries when they speak to the Russians, the subject of the Crimean platform is a worry for them, in the same way as providing weapons to Ukraine, because Russia understands that this platform would formalize the existence of this coalition which is against the illegal occupation of the Crimea, and which prevents Russia from creating the impression that everyone supports its presence at the Ukrainian peninsula. I'm sure that this hybrid war of Russia against Ukraine will end in the victory of Ukraine and in the victory of the democratic world that protects the principles and norms of international law. Therefore, the Crimean platform is important because it gathers together the democratic world around the topic of the Crimea. The next component is the European and Euro-Atlantic integration. A lot has been said about that in different formats and different platforms, and I would like to emphasize my approach and my vision of what Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration is. I believe that the membership in the EU and the membership in the NATO is not the goal in and of itself, but rather a tool to increase security, well-being, protection of rights, freedoms, and social guarantees for the Ukrainian citizens. It's a tool to make Ukraine stronger, better, and Ukraine's citizens wealthier. We continue to follow the principle of doing more for more, and we are developing this strategy in the relations with the European Union. Tomorrow, the Ukrainian president will be taking part in the Eastern Partnership Summit. It's a good opportunity to have many bilateral meetings, but I'd like to emphasize that Ukraine's politics about the Eastern Partnership is still the same. We do not perceive the format of partnership as the alternative to this intention of the European integration of Ukraine. Eastern Partnership can strengthen the integration but cannot substitute it. And I'm sure that this intention of Ukraine's membership in the EU and NATO, supported by the Ukrainian nation, will not change under any pressure, because it's only the Ukrainian nation that defines the future of Ukraine. And now, in the context of this old new demands of Russia to stop the NATO moving to the east, mainly they mean Ukraine, as all of us understand. And yesterday I actually had a meeting with Karen Donfried from the US State Department and talked to my German counterpart. I always emphasize that these demands of Putin has to be discarded, because only the Ukrainian nation, only the EU itself and the NATO itself should decide the destiny of our relations. We have the historical situation, and it's our life that over the last years we have been concentrated on the Western vector of our foreign policy.
And also on European Euro-Atlantic integration, a lot has been achieved, but we have forgotten about two important vectors, frankly speaking, and that is Asia and Africa. In 2020, we are going to focus specifically on development and enhancing our work and our positions in these regions. So, as the Ukrainian diplomacy, we will go everywhere where we see Ukrainian interests. We will go everywhere where Ukrainian businesses will see Ukrainian interests. In order to support it, to help the businesses and enhance our positions not only globally but here in Ukraine too. Because we understand that more exports is about better, more revenues to the Ukrainian budget, more jobs and higher social standards. Yesterday, we finally approved our Asian strategy, which was brought in line with other foreign relations strategy as well as the African strategy. That was the session of the Collegium of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was not commemorated to the forum. It just happened so that we did that just yesterday. And now we have these two instruments that detail the foreign policy strategy in these particular directions. So Central Asia, Southern Caucasus, the Gulf region, in the Sub-Saharan Africa region, in the Pacific region, these are going to be the key priorities. I mean, Asia and Africa are going to be the two key priorities that we are going to develop further next year in the framework of covering and working within wider horizons of the Ukrainian diplomacy and, of course, the US. That's our partner in security sector, partner number one in that sector, that's obvious. And in that connection, I like dynamics of our relations with the UK, which also is quickly becoming one of key security partners of Ukraine. And my recent visit to London was another proof of that. So, but let's go back to the US. Unprecedented number of contacts at the high level we have had during this year. Personal dialogue of President Zelensky with President Biden, the treaties, mechanisms. So the impetus has been given to this process, and the process has been developing ever faster, producing specific outcomes. In particular, the key element of these mechanics is the Strategic Partnership Commission between Ukraine and the US. It has been relaunched, and it has approved the new Charter for Strategic Partnership. And let me summarize by speaking about our economic diplomacy. This is the culture that requires a lot of time, the culture of relations between the state and businesses and working in foreign markets. This is a special culture that requires a lot of attention, a lot of efforts, among other things, in the context of busting the stereotypes and myths that exist in the society about how far the state needs to go supporting Ukrainian businesses abroad. I mean, I often witness situations where ministers of foreign affairs of other countries talking to me very specifically addressed interests of their companies, and I imagine that I go to the public and I say, now I'm going to protect the interests of this particular country, company in that country, or of another Ukrainian company, and then on Telegram you will see a lot of messages about that I'm lobbying those companies, that they pay me. So, I mean, we need to revise this culture in the society. We need to change the attitude to the government's support of Ukrainian exporters. We also need to develop the very class of Ukrainian exporters as reliable business partners. If we achieve that, eventually it will be for the benefit of the state and Ukrainian citizens. What gives me a lot of hope is that now almost 400 companies are members of the Exporters Board under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That means that businesses start trusting us. Well, this is not perfect, of course, yet, and not everybody knows about what MFA may do for Ukrainian businesses, but definitely we will do more to achieve that. We recently expanded our team. Olga Trofimtseva, she will speak to you within one of the panel discussions. She is a special ambassador for involvement of investments, attracting investments. Why we are doing that? When I met Olga, I told her, well, I have one objective for you. I want it that after a certain number of years, every Ukrainian exporter knew for sure what the MFA may do for them, can do for them, and in ideal world, they need to already have had some experience of fruitful collaboration with MFA. So I want these efforts to be visible. I want to develop this new culture. And let me highlight our cooperation with the State Service for Consumer Protection under the Ministry of Economic Development. So we have helped about 1,500 new Ukrainian companies to start working abroad, and we worked on promotion of Ukrainian produce, and soon we will present to export-oriented businesses in Ukraine a new digital tool to work in the sector, which will be convenient and efficient for businesses and for the government. So hopefully I have not taken too much of your time. For you and organizers of the event, let me just summarize. The key customer of MFA of Ukraine is the citizen of Ukraine. Yes, we are protecting the state, but above all, we do that in order that the state could develop and be a safe space for life and development of our citizens. For that sake, we defend Ukrainian interests, security, create new economic opportunities, and open the borders. During the year, we've been saving people, evacuating them from hotspots globally. We made sure that other states did not block their borders in the context of COVID pandemics. We tried to help people. However, we need to always keep in mind that no matter how long we speak about protecting the state is always about individuals, about citizens of Ukraine, everyone living in our beautiful country. And I would like to express gratitude to all of my colleagues who accept the new requirements, new approaches that we've been implementing as a team within MFA. And also, I would like to express gratitude to all the experts who work in the field of foreign policy, who do not involve in conspiracy theories to gather likes on Facebook, but who are responsible and systemic, explaining it to people what's happening and why that's important. And of course, these are experts and foreign policy journalists, because you may be an expert and not be a journalist, but you cannot be a journalist writing about foreign policy and not be an expert in the field. So, thank you so much for your attention, and thank you, Olena, and New Europe Center. Thank you for the systemic approach to, there is evidence-based medicine and there is evidence-based foreign policy. So we need to avoid all of those conspiracy theories, as it happened actually in healthcare sector. So your work is especially important there. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. the Minister. Thanks for this comprehensive and detailed presentation of the strategy. And at the end of your intervention, you mentioned the Ukrainian citizen. And actually, now we will have the opportunity to hear how this year was developing in the field of foreign policy, and actually we will speak about findings of the national poll that was implemented, commissioned by the New Europe Center. It was conducted by Info Sapiens. So Serhiy Solodky is going to present the key findings of the poll. Good morning. So you can see the 5 first key findings. I will try to save time. So we asked the Ukrainians about what their key expectations were regarding priorities for foreign policy for the next year. Number one, as you can see, the most important expectation is integration of Ukraine to the EU. And let me remind you that last year it was about economic diplomacy, but now it is in top 3 of top expectations. We asked Ukrainians with which countries we need to develop our relations. Poland and Germany got more than 90% of votes of Ukrainians, so these are top countries that Ukrainians would like to develop relationship with. But in top 5 it is also Canada, UK, US and France. Ukrainians are thinking about the Ukraine's moving westward, and NATO relations. You see that there is a little bit lower percentage of liking of the EU. However, we have higher support of NATO vector, and you will see that trend in many responses. We asked who Ukrainians trust. First of all, above all, this is the president of Poland. Last year it was Merkel, but this year she yielded to the Polish president. In top 3, Buddha, Merkel and Biden, President Biden. Another important finding is that we see stronger positions of the Turkish president, Mr. Erdogan, and for countries that Ukrainians would like to develop their relations with, we see that Turkey is going up. The most important event during the year, according to Ukrainians, it is the visit of President Zelensky to the US. And let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So we asked Ukrainians, what do you expect from the EU next year? Number one, it is perspectives of membership. Other expectations include those in the security sector. In particular, it is more active involvement of the EU in negotiations with Russia to put an end to the Russian aggression, intensified sanctions. For the US, most expectations are also about security. Most importantly, as well as last year, is security guarantees. 28.4% of Ukrainians mentioned that. The minister mentioned already that Ukraine and the allies of Ukraine must make the decision where they want to be. Ukrainians support that. 53% of Ukrainians believe that Ukraine's stepping away from the ambitions to join NATO and the EU will not put an end to Russian aggression. Whose support in the field of security is most perceived, is best perceived? This is the US, and number 2 it is EU. Ukrainians perceive that they support us in the context of the conflict, and also for more than 55% of Ukrainians support development of each of the regional strategies that were developed. There is a high percentage of support, almost 66% of support for the Ukrainian platform. So there is response and feedback to the efforts of the Ukrainian diplomacy, and I'm looking forward to further discussion. Thank you for briefly presenting the results. We will unpack them actually in the course of the panel discussions. A blitz comment from the minister. We know that you can stay with us today throughout the day. So what was your greatest surprise, or maybe what made you sad, indignated or happy about this result? Could we go back to the first slide? Let's go back to the first slide. Thank you. The first fact, we absolutely, of course, support integration, EU integration. This is not just integration, this is our roadmap, this is our vector. But again, this is not integration at any price. We need to be very rational in that process. We need to be rational, but it needs to be irreversible process. And it's nice that Poland and Germany, that Ukrainians understand that these are our two key partners in Europe. And I'm positively surprised and quite happy that the Polish president has higher support among Ukrainians. This is quite a shift from the West to Central Europe, a little bit to the East, and this goes absolutely in line with our vision of importance and significance of Central Europe and perception of Central Europe in Ukraine. We are extremely happy that Ukrainians believe that we need to become eventual members of NATO and EU. Visit of the president to the US was very important, of course. That's quite a breakthrough in bilateral relations this year at that high level. And I quite liked the discussion between the two presidents. It was straightforward, without just trying to please each other. That was a straightforward discussion between the two leaders, and I would like this tone, this quality of discussion to stick. And the recent telephone conversations prove that that is still the fact. Now, prospects of membership next year, people expect that Ukraine will have security guarantees from the US, but here I believe we need to be honest. I mean, these figures prove that most Ukrainians realize that we need to focus on more feasible objectives. However, obviously, these issues are high in the agenda. I mean, membership prospects, and maybe not so much about security guarantees, but rather about enhancing relations with the US in the sector of security. I commented on NATO. This is truly a priority, and we are acting on behalf of the Ukrainian people there. And the regional initiatives, no doubt, we will move on. We are conducting negotiations with some other countries to form more compact alliances with our best friends, so we do not stop there. But together with foreign policy strategies, well, we will definitely analyze figures from this poll, because we want our activities, efforts to be in line with expectations of the Ukrainian people. Thank you. And I wish you every success in implementing this strategy, that this culture of living with a strategy, that this culture were truly implemented in reality, in actual life. Next year, now you have two guidelines, the strategy and the poll findings. So we wish you every success, and thank you for engaging to the process of drafting the strategy. Thank you for engaging us into that process. Our think tank participated, contributed to that, and we are happy that some of our recommendations were included into the strategy. Thank you. Now I would like to pass the floor for a blitz comment to our partner, Roland Kovac, who is Chief of Party of Engage program, USAID. Due to this program, actually, we have had the opportunity to conduct the polling and to hold today's event. Roland, the floor is yours for your blitz comment.
Allow me, I will speak in English. Thank you. First of all, huge thank you to the New Europe Center and to the Minister of Foreign Affairs for making this survey possible and the presentation possible. I think we have heard amazing news from both Minister Kuleba and from Serhiy when presenting the survey. I will be very, very brief with my quick reactions, and I will tell you that what I have read is a little bit more than what's on the screens. I looked at the publication as well, and the top findings from there. And there are three things that kind of strikes me as interesting, noteworthy. One of which was on the screen. I think it was the second slide of Serhi's. And that is the expectation from the EU. That was, quite frankly, was a surprise to me to see.
Можна другий слайд попросити опитування? Дякую.
I think that's where it is. Yes. Seeing EU as a security guarantee to me was a bit of a surprise, although I fully understand that where that might be coming from. But I also know that according to the survey, the measures of closer integration with the EU are all or almost exclusively economic in nature, which I think reflects quite well reality. Second most important thing that I found in the survey findings is how Europeanization for Ukrainians is both based on interest and values. I think that's, again, is a very realistic reflection of what's going on vis-a-vis the EU for all of the member states and aspiring countries. However, I also know that there is an interesting trend, maybe not a trend yet, because there's only 2 data points yet, how values versus interests are changing in this situation. And it seems, according to the survey, it's a little bit more interest-based this year than it was last year. Lastly, as you all know, USAID engage activity, works with civil society organizations, just like the New Europe Center, and many of you sitting in the crowd. And it's very heartwarming to me to see how Ukrainians see the indicators of Europeanization. And I noted 4 things that are in the survey that gives me great confidence that civil society organizations are truly in the lead in the reform processes, because Ukrainians say that some of the indicators of Europeanization include de-oligarchization. They put high accent on the rule of law and judicial reform within. And lastly, Minister Kuleba also mentioned as a priority for the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and that is the environment. Ukrainians see also the improvement of their living conditions and their environment as a sign, improvement of that as a sign of Europeanization. So this is a huge congratulation once again, Alyona, and to all of you, engaged partners and civil society leaders taking the initiative, helping the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working with the government of Ukraine, working with leadership, but also, and more importantly, working with Ukrainian citizens to understand and be part of the changes that they want to see. Thank you.
Яка дозволяє
So thank you, and this is something really that makes it possible for us to be inclusive and to engage the society, and not only the national level. So now I invite participants of the first panel discussion, Mr. Tochitsky, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Yevhen Hlibovitsky, Professor Alexei Harany, Mr. Sushko, and Yulia Bidenko. Now we will start really digging into the foreign policy issues. So welcome our respected speakers. And it's so nice that Yevhen, Alexander, and Alexei Harany, they participated in the same discussion last year. And that makes it possible for us to track a little bit of dynamics, some developments. because there are always positive news where something changes, but also when something remains sustainable, unchanged, that may also be positive news. And I believe that our poll highlighted some of these aspects. Now I would like to switch to our dear speakers, Mykola Tochitsky. So, Mykola, you can say that Ukrainians are still very much oriented towards the Western Europe, the EU, NATO, even though they clearly realize and understand, based on the results of the poll, that in the near future we can hardly expect EU or NATO membership, and even European prospect, it is something that is not yet carved in stone. So, despite that, Ukrainians remain very much devoted, committed to the Euro-Atlantic factor. Is it about realization of that Ukraine is Europe, as people in Maidan stated? Is it about that we see no alternatives to that vector? Or do they see some kind of payback, some results of EU and NATO integration? So how would you comment on that? First of all, Alona, I would like to express gratitude to the colleagues for this opportunity to participate in this very important discussion. As the minister said, on the eve of the day of the Ukrainian diplomacy and the great Christmas holidays, we meet. But diplomats and as well as our army do not have a lot of time to get ready for the holidays, but we are working closely with our European partners in order to be ready for any challenges for the years to come. Answering your question, I would like to say that obviously it won't be easy to speak after the minister, because he is not just a good diplomat but also a great communicator. However, he has already sent this message. He mentioned the books that he recently bought and the challenges that we face. So, no alternative. This is not only about the geographic position of Ukraine, but this is also about mental and strategic perception of each of us, that we have been in Europe and we will be in Europe. Everybody understands, of course, that the red lines, as mentioned by the northern neighbor, that they remain in the neighbor's head. I mean, it is not so much about joining NATO or the EU that threatens the neighbor. The neighbor is threatened by any democratization process in Ukraine, any transparent approaches to doing business, to trade. I mean, everything that proves that we move there, not geographically, but where we move towards the collective West. This is not even a threat for Russia as such, but for Putin's regime. And the question that we focus on where the foreign policy strategy of Ukraine was developed, this is enhanced subjectivity in the international arena, and this is above all about that we believe that going back to the period that Russian Federation loves and wants to force on everyone, this is the period after 1939 through 45, so it is no longer relevant, where the Europe was kind of divided. So we need to move on, and our objective, and here I'm grateful to European partners, so we are aware of that Russia doesn't want to have a democracy as a neighbor. They don't want to see us as a free state with free citizens, free media, free civil society, and the institutions that now make it possible for us to actually have this discussion. And the second aspect, I believe that due to our partnership and as the minister mentioned, due to development of these regional formats, we try to both enhance our subjectivity but also to enhance security in general. Here Mr. Kovac mentioned that he was surprised by that the EU may be seen as a source of security. But okay, we are all experts in the field of security and international relations. We understand that security may be different. I mean, classic defense, but also security that is soft security. So any progress towards the EU functioning of the state based on the principles of standards and free markets and the economy as suggested by the EU, this is one of security reforms actually per se. So thus we, with our European partners, we work in order that the Bucharest 4 Visegrad group, and I'm grateful to the minister that he mentioned institutionalizing of our European trio, I mean 3 associated members, because I remember how much effort was invested by the head of the state and the government for that to happen. So just recently, me and my colleague, Mr. Sikorsky, we came back from Lutsk, where we had a great opportunity to be present at that meeting in Lubert Castle in the historical site, which once again proves that Ukraine has been and still is in the center of Europe, because you remember that many centuries ago, in the same place, there was one of the first peaceful summits that where they tried to put an end to invasion of another large empire. However, we discussed it there that security for the Lublin Triangle has been and is still, as well as back in the 15th century, it is our priority. It's important to see that our partners from Warsaw and Vilna, that they are focused on development of sectoral development of our collaboration, and it's so nice that we signed the tripartite document to fight fake information, misinformation, to counteract that. And I wouldn't be grateful if I didn't mention that our partners from Lublin Triangle did their best in order that this event, as mentioned by the minister, the summit of our 3 presidents, that it happened in the next days. So I'm very happy and grateful that there is this roadmap of Lublin Triangle, and frankly speaking, this is not the last regional element or structure that we are developing. And we have a couple of secrets which we will disclose as soon as possible. For the Crimean platform, the minister was very detailed, so thanks to all the colleagues here for that. On the 9th of December, we approved the resolution on militarization of the Crimea, which demonstrated that our access is much longer than the collective West. I mean, we have support from the US to Japan, from north to south. And I would be grateful if we could continue in the same direction. And we know so well that militarization of the peninsula is one of the elements that prevents us from exercising mechanisms of arms control, which actual Russian Federation signed. I mean, open skies and some other restrictions and limitations, and that's something that is very troubling, that is a concern for us. This is about illegal proliferation of nuclear materials and weapons, and it's so nice that in the Black Sea region, together with our partners, as mentioned by the minister, it's not only Georgia, not only Turkey, but also we need to speak about Bulgaria, Romania, even Moldova. Together with our partners, we will work on security in the region. And we not only kind of consume or receive services from our partners, we try to be useful, helpful to our neighbors too. Now I'm speaking about Moldova. We are doing our best so that we could do our best so that the elements, leftovers of Army 14 were withdrawn from Moldova so that Moldova had some stability. And let me summarize where Alona started. We are resolute to increase sustainability of and resilience of our state together with our Western partners. We try to work on that, we mobilize support, and we do our best in order that readiness of our partners, not only the immediate neighbors who understand very well what Russia is, what Kremlin is, but also our partners in the south, in the center of Europe. So we work with them in order to develop efficient instruments to ensure accountability of the Russian Federation for the aggression, political and legal pressure, and that will have consequences, result in consequences for Russian Federation. Thank you for focusing on this security aspect, because we are speaking about security and integration trends. Now, Yevhen, the next question goes to you. We know that previously there were these traditional roles, US about security, EU is about economics and development, but now we see some shifts there. Is it the result of this permanent foreign threat, or what's happening there? And very briefly, I know that it is difficult to be brief here because there are a lot of themes and aspects, but we need to wrap up before noon. So maybe something impressed you, especially during this year, some highlights. Okay, thank you. I believe that what's important is that the world has changed. And we know that the all policy is always local policy, and we see how the domestic policy of US, UK, other countries have changed, and what is happening in their foreign policy reflects some domestic transformations and changes. So the world is stepping back from playing the game where they win to win-win approach. I mean, since European and Euro-Atlantic security instruments are now fully functional, NATO and the EU, I mean, we can see that in European countries and in the US we see certain adaptation to those imbalances, and that practically means that the context in which Ukrainian diplomacy has to work is very different now, and the dynamics are more challenging. Another factor that we need to take into account is that actually we have stepped out from the classic situation that we had in the 19th, 20th century, where diplomats have the monopoly on foreign policy. Now there are quite a lot of entities that can exercise certain even private steps, and formal diplomacy, this is now just one of the instruments available. In that sense, what we see among priorities of the strategy for 2022 seems logical to me and quite understandable, and it seems to me quite banal, sorry for that, because I mean, these are the priorities that we should have, but it seems that we should have announced those priorities much earlier. We should have inherited, passed them over from one administration to another, but now we just start speaking about that. Another thing that I lack, this is the profound, deeper planning horizon. When we speak about diplomacy for 2022, you know, 22 will be over in a couple of seconds. Then there will be 2023, 4, 5, etc. And there are so many challenges that must be taken into account in how we work with those priorities. For example, our issue regarding some of the countries with which we have had some complications recently, that is the result of not so much misunderstanding between political elites, but it is rather about that the society, that the communities, people don't see or recognize each other. I mean, we are looking through each other. If you ask members of or citizens of European countries who are not immediate neighbors of Ukraine about life and realities in Ukraine, most likely they will come up with something very top level and very general. So we need to focus on cultural diplomacy. We need to emphasize that Ukraine needs to become more understandable and obvious for the societies, because eventually it is about a French farmer who decides on whether we are allowed to join the EU or not, or Belgian farmers, they will, or Spanish traders, they will make those decisions. So we need to go through not only formal barriers and obstacles, but we also need to convey and explain our culture. Another thing that fits into the strategy but is not sufficiently covered, this is the aspect of demographics. Ukraine has profound demographic crisis. That means that in this world we start competing for who wants to come to Ukraine, who wants to stay and live in Ukraine, take up Ukrainian identity as part of their identity. I mean, this is about educational exchange, production exchange, conveying the prospects that Ukraine offers. And there are these prospects, they are available, there are these opportunities. I work in Yaroslavl Val street in Kiev, and for some reason I see this people coming from foreign countries and they do business here and they have some opportunities. So I see a lot of foreign people in the street, but we need to convey these messages. And another thing that I lack, even though it would have fit into the strategy perfectly, I mean, maybe these aspects are covered by the strategy, but they are not highlighted. I'm speaking about what's going to happen when we go deeper in the process of decentralization. I now work in the project of developing strategy for Ivano-Frankivsk, and I see that in the next 10 years, Ivano-Frankivsk will enhance international presence, foreign markets, transboundary projects, migration of people, economic aspects, etc. And of course, that will be an activity that will not be coordinated at the centralized level. After a while, we will see a choir of Ukrainian entities that will be present in the international scene. And then the question is how to ensure synergies. I mean, how can we speak in unison so that there were no contradictions. I mean, so that when we act in the international arena, we didn't fight with each other, didn't compete. And the last question. Motion from economization to rather security focus in foreign policy, it is potentially hazardous in a country that has very weak institutions. Actually, that means that there are the risks that some of the decisions will be not accessible for the society, because there will be this natural explanation that security aspects must be discussed behind the closed door, and thus there is the risk that eventually us, the society, the public, will lose control over the process on security decision making. So we may lose this accountability factor. So I believe that it is very important that even if a lot of processes are not public, and they are not supposed to be public, but professionally they need to be transparent. Think tanks, academics, expertise need to have access to important information. They need to understand what's going on. Because in particular, the recent cases of Ukrainian governance, as we could see on the checkpoints in Donetsk Oblast, that is something that gives me concerns. And the fact that this is possible, even possible in 2021, means that we need to be cautious and we need to see where weak institutions may undermine good intentions in the strategy. Thank you, Yevhen. And now, if possible, I would like to revise our agenda a little bit, because I really want to pass the floor to someone who represents in Ukraine a country that actually is the top country in today's polling. I mean Poland. Because we can see that Poland this year appears in several top positions. This is the country with which Ukrainians would like to most intensely develop relations next year. Andrzej Duda is the leader has the highest level of confidence among international leaders, and this is very much about our priority of Lublin Triangle, and we see support for Lublin Triangle. This is where Ukraine works with Poland. So the ambassador of Poland to Ukraine, Mr. Bartosz Szychocki. Thank you so much, Alona, Mr. the Minister. So, from the very beginning, when I came to work in Kiev, I responded to this promise of President Zelensky that when he wins, Polish people will come to Ukraine to find jobs. So you see, I'm the example of that. Well, actually, from the very beginning, I was quite interested in this polling and level of confidence of Ukrainians and experts and public officials and their trust for international partners. And there are quite a lot of such polls. Yesterday, there was an event organized by Dmytro Tuzhansky, and they presented their poll. And during these 2 or 3 years, we can see significant dynamics. I remember a poll when number 1 was UK, actually, Canada, Lithuania, US as well. But now it's Poland. And there are various factors, or maybe they change very fast, those factors. And this is the reason, and it would be interesting to explain the reason why it is so volatile. And actually, in our case, there are not only the positive scenes. Quite publicly, we are ready to discuss quite challenging, conflicting topics. We are neighbors, so we cannot limit ourselves to relations at the level of governments. There are very close connections at the public level, at the expert level as well. So you cannot just contain in the cabinets, in the offices, those themes that are relevant for the society. And I mean, for us, it's not only about coffee and chocolate. So these polls are very important, and thank you for that. Thanks to those who have contributed to this result, and I'm grateful to Alona for the invitation too. It seems to me that the this year has been very intensive, and we've done a lot at the presidential level. There is ongoing communication, and you remember last year in October, Andrzej Duda with his wife visited Ukraine. That was an economic forum in Odessa, where President Duda and President Zelensky launched it. There was an important visit of Zelensky to Poland in May to celebrate the May Constitution anniversary, and there an important declaration was adopted that proves the European nature of our countries. There was joint declaration of President Duda and President Zelensky on support for European reforms in Ukraine. There was joint work and joint participation in inauguration summit of Crimean platform. That was the visit of President Duda, commemorated to 30 years of independence, but also their joint visit to Moldova for their 30-year anniversary, and a lot of things were done in order to address the energy crisis in Moldova. And in the format of Lublin Triangle too, there was an important meeting of prime ministers in Karpacz, and we understand that we looked forward to communication between chiefs of the governments, intense communication among the heads of MFAs. The Polish minister was the first one to Kiev, where Russia escalated and accumulated the troops on the border on Ukraine and the occupied territories. And there was joint statement of the ministers, MFA ministers, on Nord Stream 2, which also seems important, and it was quite visible. There was intergovernmental session of the Commission for Economic Cooperation, and above all, that was about processes in working groups. There were 7 or 8 working groups, including energy cooperation, economic cooperation, technical groups, and that's very important. Very intensively, there was very intense communication between the parliaments. Here, I would like to highlight that. And the assembly of Polish-Ukrainian parliaments, trilateral assembly with Lithuanians. There is the friendship group, and last week Mr. Stefanchuk visited this trilateral assembly in Warsaw. There was the important summit in Donbas area at the contact line. Deputy speakers of the Parliament of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine, when Russians threatened escalation. For education-related aspects, there is quite a lot of discussion, maybe not so public. However, speaking about those permits, legendary permits, on the monthly basis, we support this communication for transport ministers. Unfortunately, this intensification of relations between Ukraine and Poland usually happens not for good reasons, not for positive reasons. On the 3rd of May, we celebrate Constitution Day, or when Ukraine celebrates the Independence Day, and unfortunately then the presidents and prime ministers have to touch upon very important concerns. Above all, this is about Russia, what's happening and what could happen. That is the situation in Belarus, energy security, especially after there is the prospect of launching Nord Stream 2 COVID. It would be good to have these meetings on for nicer reasons, but unfortunately we usually consolidate when we face threats. And I believe that in the next months that will not change, or years. We hear from Russia the expectation for discussing the energy security, and again we understand that this is not about Steinmeier's formula or some elections in occupied territories. This is the decision that Russia expects. It will affect my country as well as Hungary, Romania, and the Euro-Atlantic space, actually. I mean, Poland has experience of constructive engagement into this kind of discussions. So we participated in addressing the Transnistrian crisis. Tadeusz Mazowiecki in Balkans, Ambassador Kapczak is in Minsk group, President Kwasniewski and the Orange Revolution. And the discussion of European security, it is actually not a taboo. We can speak about that. And us, Poland, we are ready to do that, but it seems to me that there are 2 conditions to develop that. First, it cannot be done when somebody blackmails and threatens military force. So when 100,000 soldiers of Russia make us discuss those issues. And also these discussions need to engage all the stakeholders in the context of European security. And natural platform would be OSCE, for example, as it happened with Medvedev's initiative. And OECD. And next year, Poland is going to lead the organization, so we could act as intermediaries to organize these discussions for all stakeholders, but not under pressure of Russian arms. Thank you.
Найбільш позитивні, але те, що стала більш позитивна атмосфера в наших відносинах, це теж очевидно, і очевидно українці теж це відчули і відчувають. Професор Олексій Гарань, пане Олексію, Доброго дня вам.
Несподівано, несподівано.
Так, щоб,
Я вільний обрати питання, які я буду.
Скажіть, а ви можете відреагувати? В мене, звичайно, до вас дуже багато питань, але ви можете, я знаю, що ви все одно маєте якийсь потужний меседж, який ви б хотіли сьогодні донести, тому ви почніть з нього. Якщо в мене вистачить часу ще на питання, я поставлю питання.
Ну окей, добре. Дякую, Альона, дякую Центру Нова Європа, Пакту і, безумовно, Міністерству закордонних справ за організацію такої дуже важливої дискусії. Я хотів би наголосити, що Міністерство закордонних справ є дуже відкритим до співпраці і що підтвердити слова Альони, що дійсно залучаються аналітичні центри до
Actually, we involve analytical centers to work on this strategy. So I have praised the ministry. It's a pity that the minister didn't hear that, but Mr. Tachitsky hears that and he will pass the message, I guess. Okay, so I start with words, some positive statements, and then I'll speak about some problematic aspects that I would like to focus on to develop some statements from the ambassador of Poland. So now we are speaking about what brings us together in counteracting the Russian aggression, and we value the support from our Western European partners, obviously. However, we believe that now the situation is such where even harsh rhetoric would not be enough. Because now it is announced that if Putin attacks Ukraine, that then there will be higher sanctions. But Putin is more sly. Let's recall 2014. Crimean sanctions didn't prevent him from coming to Donbass. Then there were sectoral sanctions related to Donbass, and in 2015, Russia captured Debaltseve. Then 2018 there were provocations and the attack on the Ukrainian vessel ships, and the sanctions were not expanded. Well, a couple of individuals were affected, but actually there were no more stringent or harsh sanctions on Russia, even though they violated the freedom of this marine operations. And now we see that Putin has announced that 70% of Azov Sea is the so-called maneuver area. His flagships are next to Mariupol, Berdyansk and Genichisk. And here the important question is, I mean, it's good that Putin heard this message about terrible sanctions, but he acts incrementally. And here we need to respond to that. And by the way, after the meeting of Putin and Biden, we hear that some pressure may be exerted on Ukraine about Donbass. And President Zelensky once again speaks about direct negotiations with Russia. We are very grateful that the Budapest 9, by the way, that they insisted Bucharest, of course, not Budapest. Bucharest 9, they insisted on talking to President Biden, and they raised some important issues that need to be discussed not only with the Western Europe, but also with Eastern Europe. And we are grateful for that. Then, speaking about direct negotiations with Russia, we know that President Zelensky insists on that, and now according to the latest rating poll, from which media they took this figure that 56% of Ukrainians support direct negotiations with Russia. Well, actually it was taken out of the context, because in the same poll there is this breakdown. I mean, when you ask the multiple option questions, whether you prefer Norman format negotiations with US and the UK, or sticking to the current format, or direct negotiations with Russia, direct negotiations were only supported by 20% of respondents. And that is absolutely supported by our data, Democratic Initiatives Foundation. I mean, this group that kind of supports negotiations with Russia covers very different categories of people. Those who believe that it's possible to talk to them only if they agree to some concessions. Those who say that in this format you can only discuss some humanitarian issues for Donbass, nothing more, etc. I just wanted to emphasize that this figure, 56%, it needs to be explored deeper. And I invite journalists and our Western partners to be very attentive and analyze other figures in the polling, even rating polling, not to just snatch it out of the context. Speaking about important concessions for uncontrolled territories, and that President Zelensky said something about referendum. Well, Ukrainians do not accept the idea of concessions at any price for Donbass. What Russia requests is unacceptable. Among Poroshenko's electorate, 88% believe that we are in the state of war between Ukraine and Russia. What's the figure among electorate of Zelensky? That's a rhetoric question. Nobody takes the risk to answer. Well, that's 84%. I mean, 84% of people ready to vote for Zelensky, they believe that this is the war between Ukraine and Russia. And then you could come up with a variety of other figures that prove that Ukrainians would not support the concessions on the part of Ukraine on the one unilateral basis. So I believe this is something that needs to be taken into account. And my last statement is about the Crimea. Because here, without opposing our data to the data that have been presented by New Europe, I just wanted to highlight some nuances, some aspects, because we also presented results on the Crimea on the eve of the Crimean platform. We did that. I will not go into detail. This is in public domain. But here, in New Europe polling, people say that the most promising ways to bring back the Crimea, it is to cover the territory of the Crimea with TV and radio broadcasting from Ukraine, then restoring trade, cultural and educational links. Well, I believe that cultural and educational links, that's clear what that is, but for the economic links, maybe it is rather daring. However, in our survey, we offered another option, which actually complements that. So when we ask people what should be the path, what should be the way to bring Crimea back to Ukraine, number one, 47% of people supported the option of implementing diplomatic efforts to implement more stringent, strict international sanctions against Russia. Well, us Ukrainians, we are romantic. We may be romantic, but we are also pragmatic. So we understand that it's very difficult to enhance international sanctions. There are different opinions in every EU member state. There are different opinions among countries. However, the situation is not getting better in the Crimea. It's getting worse. We see a greater number of political prisoners. And I am not a young person, so I remember the Cold War. And I remember that during the Cold War, any negotiations of Western leaders with Soviet leaders addressed the issue of political prisoners, dissidents. And let's not forget about that. How many Ukrainians are now in jails in Russia and in the Crimea? Thank you. Thank you. These are very important messages. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Yulia Bidenko from Kharkiv, and she has traveled to Kiev to participate in this event because, as I mentioned, New Europe Center is against the trend of Kiev centricity. We remember that Ukraine is not just Kiev. So, Yulia, what are your reflections about this poll and the strategy? So do you recognize this moods of Kharkiv in Kharkiv and the region, or maybe for you it looks different? So what does foreign policy look like from Kharkiv? Thank you for this question, and I would like to express gratitude to Sergei Solodky and to the entire team of New Europe, because this is very important and interesting survey. Recently, Rating Group conducted that survey, so we can compare and see the relevance of the figures. But let me remind you that diplomatic decisions are supposed to be made based on public opinion, of course. However, in order that every strategy worked, it needs to resonate with that public opinion to correspond to it. So I'm very grateful for this survey because it is very detailed, and here we can see quite a lot of opinions, the entire range of the aspirations that are supported by Ukrainians or not. You asked me about Kharkiv. I would say that Kharkiv is a small version of Ukraine. I mean that for us, security is above all, of course, the need for security focused diplomacy. And actually, other surveys of New Europe, Euromaps, they prove that Kharkiv is among top 5 regions that are leaders in the aspect of sectoral European integration. And of course, this flagmanship initiatives, they are mostly about education, science, IT cluster, creative industries. This is actually something that has not been affected dramatically by the Russian aggression and as a result of reformatting of export flows. Kharkiv lost 40% of its exports, and maybe that makes Kharkiv residents more pragmatic than totally for Ukraine. But nevertheless, most Kharkiv residents support Euro integration and the vector, so it doesn't fluctuate, doesn't change this figure dramatically. And about 20% of residents in Kharkiv still consider going back to economic relations with Russia if this aggressive policy subsides. But let me emphasize something else. I hear what Yevgen said about decentralization of the foreign policy. That was also the statement with which I actually came here. And most importantly, it is communication of foreign policy in the regions. Because decentralization as a reform has resulted in that we actually don't know what elites do in Vinnytsia or what is done by heads of territorial communities in Frankivsk region. But we know that they also develop this foreign links, and visits to Poland actually make one of the factors that supports the authority of territorial leaders. They look for business contacts in Europe, and we need to keep in mind that communicating priorities in the community, at the community level, at the level of the regions, oblasts, is very important, because Russian aggression, actually, it is about regions and territorial communities. They worked with that level. Another important aspect, this is communication of security, which we lack now, security issues, because we understand that there is this threat of aggravation and aggressive steps by Russia, but we don't quite understand which messages could be the trigger for action. And we don't have a collective strategy for certain actions. I mean, I've talked to my colleagues from the education sector, Team Europe initiative. This is from an EU initiative in Kharkiv, but we have individual survival strategies in that situation. But it seems that we don't see clear messages what's going to happen. Moreover, this communication and comments on foreign policy supporting Ukraine on this regarding this optimistic Western track, it is very important in the context of the subjects, entities within this communication. I mean, communication needs to be supported by highly professional public officials and experts, because currently this year and last year in Kharkiv, well, I'm afraid that this communication will be monopolized by politicians. you are right saying that 2022 will pass very quickly and we need to look forward to 2024. And frankly speaking, I'm quite concerned about that we will approach that politically important year with a significant number of people who can be easily manipulated, including regarding foreign policy. Actually, in Novaya Europa's survey, when answering the question of who's going to be the key ally of Ukraine in case Russia attacks, most people say not US, even though the rating gives you this idea. Most people didn't know how to answer that question because support from US, that is 26%, but 34% of Ukrainians have no answer to that question, which seems important to me. So let's communicate not only externally but also domestically conveying these messages. Thank you so much. I was impressed by that. The US, even though with the previous government and currently, even though we love this slogan by Donald Trump, who is no longer the president, that America above all, but Ukrainians see that these other states that we need to develop actually relations with. And the US may be in top 5 or top 3 with Canada and UK, but they follow Poland and Germany. I mean, in the society, they see these priorities in a little bit different way versus perception of Ukrainian government and authorities and partners. Okay, Alexander, is it surprising for you that the US was not mentioned there? I mean, first it is Poland, then Germany as key bilateral partners, and I have another question about indicators of the European integration. I mean, when Ukrainians see that Ukraine is moving towards the EU, not just pretends that. 5 years ago, when we first raised that question, and last year, those were very pragmatic indicators. Social infrastructure improved, servicing in kindergarten, schools, hospitals, building roads. We can see that these positions are becoming weaker, and we see that value indicators are growing. The rule of law, anti-corruption, that it gives results, oligarchization, etc., and also the environment. These are the 4 indicators that have become more important for the people, and there people are going to be guided by them to judge, to say whether we are on the path of European integration. Could you respond to that? Thank you, Alona. Thank you, colleagues. So this is truly very interesting to participate in these long-term discussions that we have had from year to year. And I remember last year's meeting discussion here, and I tried to recall what I was speaking about then. I don't have my notes, but I do recall some of my statements, and it is important to ground on them above all. So then I spoke about a certain conditionality of our pro-Western consensus, that it is conditioned by certain external factors. And then I said that there is the risk that this consensus would be weakened under certain conditions. And now we can see that it hasn't weakened. We see quite significant consolidation to the extent possible for the Ukrainian society and political community. However, again, that happens above all because those foreign or external factors that condition consolidation have got even stronger. I mean, this is the Russian policy above all, that they have become even more aggressive. So we have seen the whole range from conceptualization. This is the article of Putin on historical unity and the respective publications by Surkov, Medvedev, this huge propaganda attack. Then enhanced historical tone in Russian media, which echoes here, and the recent months what's been happening along the Ukrainian border. We had that in April, and we have this now. All in all, this really enhances this perception of threat, and they do not leave much chance for any alternative solutions. Of course, from the point of view of sustainability of our European vector, that's good. But from the point of view of exploring and understanding the root of that sustainability, well, there we feel certain that these realities are rather shaky. I mean, okay, we have Putin as he is. He is unable for flexible policy, even though several years ago it did seem that he was a bit more clever, because hypothetically he knows those instruments that could make his policy more flexible, but he doesn't use that. We will not analyze why, but currently the Russian policy is so straightforward, so uncompromising, that actually it doesn't leave any space in Ukraine for legitimation of pro-Russian positions. And also, considering the asymmetric nature of the conflict with Russia, it leaves very little space for maneuver for isolationism, because we did have signs of that in previous years. But now, since there is understanding of that, we won't be able to counteract Russia for a long time on our own, that there is this disparity of resources, there is realization of the need for a sustainable alliance with key Western countries. But it is also clear to me that if the situation changes, for example, if Russia, hypothetically, of course, implements a more flexible approach to forcing their friendship on Ukraine, that in Ukraine we will go back to all of those discussions and illusions about the third path, about whether we need that Europe because Europe is in crisis, etc. These discussions have not disappeared. They have marginalized so far because of the steps by Russia. Plus additional factors, Belarus. This is what we didn't have before. Well, Belarus has always been a factor, but not to that extent. Until recently, they even tried to play the role of an intermediary and neutral country in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. But now it is obviously part of the Russian machinery, and that enhances this anxiety and perception of no alternative for our Western vector. And this is something that is kind of sustainable. I believe we can see that as a constant trend for the next years. And on the other hand, due to the straightforward approach of Russia, we do see mobilization of the Ukrainian society and confirmation of our Western vector. On the other hand, we still have those internal forces that see the Western vector as a compromise that not necessarily meets their long-term objectives, in particular in the context of those values, and your poll highlights that they are furthermore associated with the European choice, because the state, based on the rule of law and on separating businesses from politics, on integrity, this state does not meet all the strategies of the Ukrainian stakeholders, because there are quite a lot of beneficiaries of the other Ukraine, and they have not disappeared as a result of the Russian aggression. They are just a little bit hushed down now. And this is the key dilemma that will set the corridor now for all the forces, and the corridor is quite narrow for all the alternative forces, but time will change. And of course, I would have liked to respond to a number of statements by the colleagues. By the way, it will be possible to do that online during the coffee break. I wanted to emphasize this component of non-governmental, civic, cultural diplomacy. I agree with statements by various colleagues on that, Yevhen. Above all, we've discussed that a lot. So here, actually, we hear a lot of voices. And now the capacity of non-governmental entities to convey their position is much stronger versus 10 or 20 years ago. That is why this is no longer just a handful of leaders who 20 years ago acted as civil society leaders of Ukraine at the international arena. Now it is much, much more. It would even be difficult to map these parties, these entities who are interested in presenting themselves to the international community, and they develop their capacity, their skills, knowledge, and they are ready to act. And obviously there will be no you will not be able to kind of organize them so that they speak in the same voice, but there is still a lot of potential for synergies. There are the opportunities that have not yet been used, opportunities to ensure coordination, to be on the same page, to work in a more focused way with certain target groups that have a significant impact on on public opinion in their countries, and that could receive much more information from Ukraine, communicated in a variety of ways. And in order to add to that strategic vision, I would like to ask you to take into account that very important component of civic diplomacy. Very briefly, yes, just 30 seconds. And if you would like Yevgen, Mykola, to add something, maximum 30 seconds, you're welcome. Well, with donors you can never, of course, fight, but I could debate my counterparts, especially Mr. Sushko. I absolutely agree with what Alexander mentioned, that there are these risks associated with this third path, etc. Alexander is right speaking about that now the policy of Russia is very straightforward, and maybe one day they will try to act more flexibly. But what I wanted to to attract your attention to, it is that in 2019 Zelensky came with rather pacifist slogans, and then what was discovered, that most of his voters anyway support the idea of EU, NATO, and against compromises with Russia, I mean, at any price. And that public opinion was a very important factor that actually prevented the Ukrainian leadership from some unjustified concessions. And what was the most important factor, and what was the greatest teacher for Zelensky, it was Putin, actually, who proves that you can never trust Russia. Okay, Mykola? Just to reinforce the statement of many of the previous speakers who are professionals and experts in this area, I would like to express gratitude to you, Alena, because we see that now Ukrainians start seeing results of Euro integration not only in sectoral aspects, but now we go to higher levels. This is about morality, the judicial reform, anti-corruption. So due to educational efforts, this is now a reality, and that means that people have this level of consciousness. Without any reform of the judiciary, decentralization, communication, or other sectors cannot function efficiently. I mean, above all, we need to focus on efficient justice sector, and then that will be the backbone for competition. The strategy is just a project draft at the very beginning. Then it transforms into a process. So it's important to stick to the strategic approach, to that we could see the new factors to ensure and the harmony between the framework of the ministry, of the society, of the country in general. And we need to start and build into this framework compliance with the stated priorities or rules. Then after several years, it will be clear that probably we see these elements of irreversible course of action. Okay, then we sum up this part of the discussion. We have a very short coffee break. You can take your coffee with you. And then we will continue with the discussion that is going to be focused on economic diplomacy, which is one of key priorities too. So we are grateful to the participants of the panel discussion.
Доброго дня, шановні наші глядачі.
So, dear audience of Diplomacy 2022 online, we now have coffee break at the event, and we suggest that you join us with coffee or tea in the course of expert discussion. We will result findings of New Europe polling. We have invited Hanna Hopko and Daniel Szychowski. Hanna Hopko is head for protection of natural interests and the Polish Institute of International Relations of Poland. So my first question goes to you. What was the key discovery or surprise for you within this survey regarding the expectations of Ukrainians of 2022 in the context of foreign policy? Thank you for inviting me. I would like to tell you that I was surprised by Poland. It's not that I was surprised, I believe that's very logical, but I was surprised with this significant increase in the confidence in the US President Joe Biden. I believe that the president needs to deserve this trust, because you have this Nord Stream 2 and discussions with Russia about European security. I'm a bit concerned there. I'm not quite convinced. And part of, well, to what extent this is really about adequate perception of the situation in Eastern Europe, whether they really want to agree with Russia and focus on China, this is what concerns me, and I will probably stop here. Hanna? To continue what was mentioned by the expert, Ukrainians saw the presidency of Joe Biden as a window of opportunities. There were a lot of expectations about that. As soon as he comes in office, we will see a very rigid position on Nord Stream 2, and we will see those very stringent functions, because it is the 8th year of the Russian aggression, and instead of speaking about Putin's taking back his army from Ukraine, we speak about new blackmail, escalation, and new polyvariant threats of the attack, now not only in the east of Ukraine, but now we see the situation in Belarus, which is the Achilles heel for the West now. So I would like the authorities and the embassy that they could of the US that they could look through these figures and actually take steps in order to protect the democracy, in order to bring Putin back to where he belongs, especially after he was speaking so nervously with Sakurov about the actual situation in the Russian Federation, but not to consider China. Okay, we have started with the security issues. According to New Europe Center, 60% of Ukrainians believe that concessions will not stop Russia if Ukraine steps back from aspiration for EU membership or NATO. That will not change the aggressive policy. So, do you believe that they will hear the will of the people in European capitals, and how much is that taken into account? So I really liked what Minister Kuleba said about daring foreign policy of Ukraine. I believe that this is a very adequate approach. So you really need to protect your interests. And I am quite a pessimist there, because you say whether Western communities will hear this message, whether they will understand the moods in Ukraine. I'm not sure there. All of us know that there are countries that are quite positive about Ukraine's aspirations and interests, and they know much about the situation of the war with Russia, and that Russia captured the territories. But there are still influential forces in the West that want to go back on track with Russia and negotiate and trade with them. So I don't want to be an alarmist and speak about catastrophes, but I believe that there Ukraine needs to really be quite rigid defending its interests. And then we will need to work on that track.
Over the 8 years of the Russian military aggression, Ukrainians have made it clear that we are not ready for painful compromising. We are not ready to sacrifice our interests. So there are those who want to trade with Russia, those who have some fears before Russia. They want to have some dialogue and they want to limit some risks imposed by China. There needs to be the understanding that over the 30 years, Ukrainians have proven their readiness to fight for their place in the history. We are a contributor to the European security. And here is something that was mentioned this year on the 20th session of UN on the rights of the Aboriginal people. There were two flags, one of them being the flag of Ukraine. This was our step of solidarity of those who are solidary with the repressions of the Putin's regime. And this is a way to support those who are in the difficult situation. Right now we could hear from Putin that we are having some internal problems with the Russian Federation. So this aggressive politics of Putin is a way to tackle many of the issues that are right now being observed in the Russian Federation. And let us look into the views of Ukrainians on the Russian Federation. It's not only about the well-being, it's not about the economy, but also we are noticing that the oligarchic management of the country is being liquidated. So we, as a center, had the first international conference on democracy in action with participation of the presidents of Ukraine and Moldova, and it's a good step representing the institutional capacity of Ukraine, showing its ability to impose its own agenda, to be a trendsetter in offering solutions, answering to the hybrid challenges to democracy. Thank you, Hanna. So you have proceeded to the Euro integration, and indeed, according to the survey of the center, first and foremost, it's about the economic indicators, it's about new jobs, it's about overcoming corruption. But my question goes to Daniel. So this was the vision of Ukrainians. This is their vision of the Euro integration. But you are looking from the outside, from Poland. How would you comment about the indicators of successful integration? These factors, as Anna has mentioned, I believe they can be perceived in different ways. It's not only about the economic indicators, because this fight against the oligarchic system, yes, on the one hand, there is an economic factor. It's a way to introduce new rules in the country. I believe this is a political factor that shows in real time the Euro integration of Ukraine. I do understand why Ukrainians have this perception of the EU, or why the EU is associated with economic indicators. It's natural that everyone wants to have a better life, and we Poles also had the same desire back in the day. If we had some compromises with Russia, we would not be taken there. But it's also about following the new rules. It's about overcoming the oligarchic system. And this is, I believe, the true reflection of Euro integration, and we need to work carefully in this regard. And we do understand that this is just the beginning, and there is still a lot to be done. I believe we need to at least know in which direction to move, and Ukrainians, I believe, know the right direction already. So in this regard, I am the optimist. So in order to get that support from the partners for the successful European integration, this partnership has to be developed. So the Ukrainians believe that Poland and Germany are the top countries that are suitable for the partners, and Duda is a trusted person. So what's your attitude, Daniel, and is it a surprise for you, or do you support this view of Ukrainians? Do I support it? For sure. I mean, it's not a surprise to me, and I have always said that sooner or later this would happen. Some time ago, you had an experts survey, and it was about visiting Poland first, and so. Okay, so what about your expectations from diplomacy in Ukraine in 2022? I do hope that with Daria and Alena we are going to have the second conference, Zero Oligarchs, Democracy in Action, in order to strengthen the Crimea platform and also to present the Black Sea strategy. And I believe this policy to support the aboriginal nations of the Russian Federation, this is something that's going to continue. And also the issues on the environment, about the limitations on the pollutants. This is also something that needs to be implemented as a part of the association agreement. Thank you. So here we probably will have to end here. Sorry, Daniel, for not giving you the floor. And dear audience, we are going to have our second panel right now. Thank you so much.
Доброго дня. Починаємо.
Hello, we are starting our second panel on the economic diplomacy, and as you could have heard from our minister, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has 6 main areas in the foreign policy. Economy is just one of the priorities, but since this is the priority that has a separate panel here, this shows that the economic diplomacy is one of the top priorities for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and for the Ukrainian government in general. So I'm glad to introduce our guests. The first one is Olga Drafimtseva, the Deputy Minister of Agri-Policy, and right now she works for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This will be her first presence in her new office. We will hear about the tasks she had before her and about the ways to assess the effectiveness of her work. We also got used to the fact that Taras Kachka, Deputy Minister of the Economy, was responsible for the economic relations, so we also will hear from Taras on how he's going to work together with Olga if there is no conflict of interest, if there is if there are any limitations. So we will hear a lot about that. We will look at the success of the economic diplomacy, and for that we will hear from experts and participants of the market, such as Lev Vishnevsky, the director of the Center for Economic Strategy. We will hear from him about the needs of the Ukraine's economy, and we will hear about the tasks posed before itself by the government. And quite soon we will be joined, I hope, by Yuri Lutsenko, who is the partner of Cohen Consulting Integrated, who is promoting the Ukrainian expert in the countries of Asia, through Japan, for instance. And as an expert, he will share how successful the Ukrainian diplomats are in the advancing of the interests of the Ukrainian business.
So let's start. I know that Taras has limited time, so let's start with him. Taras, to what extent do you believe Ukrainian products, commodities have been promoted in international markets? To what extent are diplomats successfully engaged into that? Minister has left, so you can tell us the truth. And what are the objectives for next year? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I believe that the theme is like endless, because we could speak about macro and micro levels and about a variety of geographies, various understanding of economic diplomacy, or economic diplomacy, right? So we can speak about a variety of, above all, what we are discussing here. Above all, this is about, well, I believe that more people have joined online, so above all we need to keep in mind that economic diplomacy related issues, that we understand that in a little bit distorted way, because economic diplomacy, this is not just about promoting Ukrainian products in foreign markets, because currently, above all, most importantly, this is about that due to this apolitical 1990s and the Washington consensus, super neoliberal one, not even in the classical understanding of or post-war understanding of classic liberalism, but actually what we observed back in 1990s, what what Dutch people refer to as tulip diplomacy, where the main objective of MFA in developed countries, advanced countries, was about their economic development. So against that, we can see interesting developments where geopolitical issues have become relevant ago, because now we are at the breaking point geopolitically, but this is something that develops in the economic sector as well. And now we can see that geopolitics have been exercised via economic instruments. So we can see that based on ideological opposition with China, some technological aspects, telecom technologies, and the very open strategic autonomy strategy of the EU, and the aspects of human rights or labor rights or environmental protection, that it fits into the economic or trade policy. So above all, economic diplomacy is something that has penetrated into very classical war and peace related issues, and we can see that because for Russia, casus belli was signing the association agreement. Actually, that was the first thing where we invested 2 or 3 years in dialogue with the EU and the Russian Federation. And rationally, we realized that that is nothing outstanding. However, that triggered the aggression of the Russian Federation. And it's interesting that this year our export is going to get higher than what we had in 2013 before the Russian aggression. Surprisingly, in the Russian direction, the Russian export will be higher too. So the only parts, stakeholders affected by this aggression was the occupied territories, because there we witness economic collapse. So this is one thing, and important thing that we forget about when we speak about economic diplomacy. Another important aspect, just one more minute, this is about that now we are in the period where we develop economic narratives. So the Spring Summit of Food Systems and the Glasgow conference that didn't take place, and the very fact that it was postponed, that is also an important message. So all of these 3 events, they are the events that have not resulted in any global consensus. The other way around, they have proven how differently each country understands economic development. That applied to the industrial systems, where we said that we need to ensure environmental, ecological sustainability of agribusiness. That is why organic production above all. But other countries said that we need to come over the problem of hunger. We cannot do that with organic production. So we need efficient agriculture with chemical production and genetic modification. And this discussion is still open, and we don't know where it will take us. Same for the environment. In trade, it is a wide range of opinions, because it is difficult to bring everybody to the table and negotiate that. So if you think that it is relevant for China, EU and the US, you are mistaken. There is also India that blocks quite a lot of negotiations for hundreds of other states, and this is a significant narrative for 10 years ahead that requires quite significant diplomatic work. You remember that diplomatically we spoke about disarmament, and only those experts who were involved in those discussions, they knew what that was about, because that was quite detailed and technical. Same applies to environment. And the third aspect that is familiar to us all, and this is a kind of economic negotiations, and this is an extensive field, because we need to keep in mind that Ukraine exports everything and everywhere. So based on our trade statistics, we sell everything everywhere. And we have this deep theme. This is our region, Europe and Mediterranean, and there you can dig on and on, because our integration with European markets, it is something that will take, that is for lifetime, because it seems that they are our key partners. However, we have reached the potential of the association agreement and where it is now, and so we now require more projects for further integration with the EU. we have launched this pan-European and Mediterranean accumulation. We now need to involve Turkey in order to cover the Black Sea region under FTA of wheat, for example, and that is based on the certificate but not trade statistics. And that's about the depths of trade policy. You need to understand the terminology, and this is another aspect relevant for economic diplomacy. Speaking about Africa, that's fashionable, that's trendy, but every country is different, and this is not Klondike. I mean, this is not an endless source of money, but there are prospects for further work there, and this applies to every group of commodities. We could speak in more detail there, and the more detail you speak about that, the more time you need to allocate for that. So any efforts are important, but the first two components, this is the geopolitical component of the economics, and developing those narratives, that's what is extremely important for us. And here we need to focus not only on quantity but also on quality, thinking about what we work on. But what do you think are going to be the key challenges next year? What's the Ukrainian foreign trade activities facing? The first, well, there are a lot of challenges, and above all, we need to keep in mind that if we seriously speak about trade, recently there was an article in Politico where, when we joined WTO under the current conditions, they were putting pressure on us, but now they say that international trade, it is domestic policy. This is not about foreign policy. This is the domestic policy, and this is about how the economy develops, internal political discussions, and so on and so forth. So actually, I absolutely agree with that, because quite often we are trying to win in foreign markets where we don't yet have the commodities to export there. For example, sanitary barriers that we discussed recently, like exporting apples to India. But and there was this discussion if it is phytosanitary issue, or is it about the issue related to the offer on our side? Because in Indian market, for example, apples, it is an exotic and expensive fruit, as mango for us. So just some low quality apples in containers would not sell there, because it is luxury. It needs to be neatly put in boxes, and it needs to look well.
So this condition of the internal market and its development is a much higher challenge than the access to the external markets. And also, we have some good things. We are not maybe realizing all the good things we have. And in 2021, we are going to update our export strategy. And what changes are we going to see there? The changes are very limited, because the globe is the same, the priority goods are the same, the services we are providing are the same. The details sometimes may change, but if the MENA region is our key region, and if there is a big demand for our products in Southern Asia, this will be our priority. The new things are two. First, there is a high demand for the quality change and integration with the European Union, with the road transportation, with a visa-free regime. And actually there will be a huge tactical challenge in the field of road transportation. I hope we will be dealing with this issue successfully in the first coming months. And the second element here is rethinking of digital services. We are exporting IT services already. We are earning on them more than we are earning on the gas transit. Of course, the transit is going down and the IT services are going up. Therefore, this is an important part here, and this is a task for the to the government to think about its digital trade politics. And this is something that is right now observed in the UK's agreement with Singapore. There are some top of the top new agreements with them in the field of digital. And our first step is the agreement with Canada, where digital will be one of the main elements. But the highest challenge here is to understand ourselves. And there is a very interesting country in which we are to which we are exporting IT services and importing coal. This is the United States of America. So who is a well-developed country and who is the exporter of raw materials? I don't know in this situation. So we have to love ourselves. We have to love our natural resources and our ability to provide them. Okay, that's something we have been discussing with Olga. We have to have a respectful attitude to our grain producers. All of this is absolutely normal. We are not super underdogs anymore. It's not like we are not on the market and we still have to get there. There are some fields in which we have to gain traction and to develop our policy more confidently. But before we let you go, I would like to ask a question. Yeah, I'm not in such a hurry. Yeah. Okay, so there are two questions. One is about the review of the association agreement, what's happening and what can be expected next year. And the second political challenge about Lukashenko's statements about the Crimea. There is some real chance that Ukraine will have to close down its trade relations with that country and to introduce full sanctions against it. Are we ready for that, and what can be used to compensate for the Belarusian market? Okay, your question one, reviewing the association agreement. It starts from reading the association agreement, and this is in fact one of the senses of this word. We need to understand what exactly is meant there, because this can be quite an abstract thing, but it also can involve some concrete steps. So this review is not just one consolidated process of associations. Just when we signed the associated agreement, we had a delegation that went chapter by chapter and discussed it. Right now, we do not have such a comprehensive process for the review of all the contents of the agreement. But we have about dozens of different tracks that are enabling the potential of the agreement. This is something I actually did not believe in when we were discussing the association agreement in 2015, 2016. When we were traveling to the regions of Ukraine. Back then, all of this seemed very theoretical. But our first cherry on the cake is liberalization of tariffs in agriculture. There is a formal process. We are awaiting the final position of the European Union, and it is understandable that with each new position, with each new stakeholder in the new stakeholder in the European Union, they are losing some of the ambitions. Some people are not okay with our corn. Some people are not okay with our tomatoes. So what else can we offer? Well, we'll still have something, and still there is some constructive position. We can see that Valdis Dombrovskis is politically very favorable for these negotiations to happen well, but then we also have the visa-free regime for the commerce, and we are hearing in much of the detail about standardization, metrology, etc., etc. And on Monday we had the presentation of the third mission out of 8. In January we are going to have the fourth mission on metrology, so we are gaining traction here. As for the customs visa-free mode, the common transit system, the mutual recognition of authorized economic operators. This is something in which the European Union is making pressure on us than the other way around. There is quite an interesting situation with the access to the public procurement, and the European Union has agreed to proceed with the first and the second phase of opening the market. We understand that we can open those levels, and this year we will have the law on localization approved in full accordance with these requirements, and we can open up to the level that is specified there rather than to 100%, and this expedited the openness of the European Union, which serves in our favor. So there are numerous examples of this kind, and this is what I mean by reviewing the association agreement. Also, this year we are assessing the association agreement together, and this is the issue to be answered by the Office of Euro-Atlantic Integration. And next year, probably, the agreement can be reviewed in the classical legal sense. In Belarus, we can see the example of how difficult it is to combine the foreign policy with the trade. So let's direct that question to Olga, and hear what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is going to do in this regard. So this is how we gradually make the transition to Olga's remarks. So again, these are your first remarks in this new office. So what should we expect from you? What are your tasks? How are you going to be assessed? I mean, the effectiveness of your work. And yeah, please answer about Belarus. Thank you. This is quite an interesting event here, a very important one. And in the first panel, we could hear a lot of presentations. And in the remarks of our foreign minister, we had lots of messages also pertinent to our panel. So officially, I have not been approved to the new office yet, but this is again a part of the new normal, because you don't have the time to wait till all of the bureaucratic details will be complete. We have to start work, and that I have to start doing the work I'm required to do. So thank you once again for making this presentation and making the presentation of my office. And first, I'd like to respond briefly to what has just now been mentioned by Taras. As you could understand from his remarks, that we are working together for quite a long time, and any attempts to make us enemies or our department's enemies will be fruitless. So everything that was mentioned by him about the interdependency with the economic issues and the activities he spoke about, they show how important it is in the world recently to see the issues of ecology, food security, geopolitics, security, and the issues of economy and trade, and as intertwined. So this coordination, this work of different industries, different ministries and institutions, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Vice Prime Ministers, etc. This is right now not a mere desire, but this is a necessity for Ukraine to stay in this context and to successfully represent ourselves in the field of economic diplomacy, to promote the interests of the Ukrainian business in the global markets, and thus also getting the international investments for our internal economy to develop. And once again, these things are interconnected, and I always emphasize that even in this my new role, I emphasize that in this fast-changing world, the role of Ukraine is to find its place in the chains of added value, to find our place in the chain of service provision in order for us to be compatible and for us to be more visible wherever we are not visible enough. And the statistics shows that we are selling the agricultural products to 122 countries. We are covering the entire world with these products. So coming back to your question, Yuri, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has an understanding that the importance of the economic policy grows, and these approaches that Mr. Kachka has mentioned, and understanding this role, we need to pay more attention, more resources, and have more mechanisms intended for these purposes. So the Council of the Exporters and Investors was created for this very purpose. For some period it was a sleeping institution, but right now there is a very big ambitious task for me personally to make this Council of Exporters and Investors into a real entry point for the Ukrainian business, for them to understand that there is this platform under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to get support as regards to opening the doors of the foreign markets, and also providing advice. So this has to be truly an advisor of the Ukrainian business abroad, and also it needs to provide the networking capabilities. I fully support the idea of the minister concerning changing the attitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as regards to the support of the Ukrainian business abroad. And I can confirm that previously, as the deputy minister, as an active minister, I sometimes could see other ministers visiting us with their trade attaches. They were raising the issues related to the interests of their countries, or their businesses working in our country. And here we are seeing the same change on the micro level, and coming back to the macro level, we need to become more active in the support provided by the Ministry of Economy concerning the work in international organizations at the global level, on the regional level, strengthening bilateral cooperation with the countries that are of importance for us, and also in terms of development of the economic relations. There are such important aspects as the growing technological competition, and also the changes in the general trade relations, where Ukraine has to respond faster and has to respond in a more consolidated manner, if we mean the government institutions such as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Ministry of Economy. And here I believe there is no distinction between the institutions. It's not like only some of us are responsible for the particular functions. No, all of you are responsible. And this confirms once again what Taras has said and what Mr. Kuleba has said today. You probably remember that he mentioned about the establishment of the class of Ukrainian exporters. I believe this can become a wonderful slogan for the Ukrainian export for the forthcoming years, for the midterm prospects, because as you could hear from our trade attaché, that quite often we do not have demand for certain products in Ukraine, but also, as we can see from the practical experience with business, Ukrainian business is not always ready to provide the kind of product in the kind of quality and quantity and at the competitive price at which the international market is ready to buy it. And so all of those issues, starting from global and ending with the local, they require a more focused attention. They require a more systematic and sustainable work. And these are always the keywords I'm using. They have to be systematized, systematic, and sustainable in this work, which requires everyone, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to get involved. And I hope that in my role, I will be able to contribute to the Ukrainian business in terms of the structured communication and also in terms of the support in opening the doors and the networking on the external markets with the use of the diplomatic channels, just like all the other countries are doing, just like our esteemed partners are doing. As for Belarus, I am not sure whether I am available for comments on such a sensitive issue, so I would like to abstain. Or would you like Teres to respond? I will gladly respond, because Belarus is a good example of our greatest challenge, because on the one hand, we are united with Belarus with the agreement on free trade, regardless of its membership in the Eurasian economic value, and also Belarus is a member of the World Trade Organization, so we have the trade working both ways. And if we have two of the goods that are of critical importance, such as oil products from the city of Mosul, and it's nearby, and it's also important for them, and it's also important for us to buy the fertilizers. But outside of that, we have also the trade in which small and medium businesses are active, and it works both ways. And here we have to understand that there is no situation of full dependence, but there is a situation of business interdependence. And right now, unfortunately, there is some antagonism in the field of security. We understand that the European Union is not using the mechanisms of full embargo, but we also see that the challenges we have right now with Belarus, they are of security nature. So if some economic sanctions are imposed, we should see that this is a part of the security policy. And we also need to understand that this interdependence is very difficult to untie, because every time we are getting this business that some major Ukrainian manufacturer depends on some goods from Belarus, which is also manufactured here in Ukraine, but everyone has some competitive advantages, and we always emphasize the fact that indeed these security challenges with Belarus is not about some one-day crisis that will end 2 months ago. That's what we previously had, that there were some small petty disagreements and then the presidents would come together and this would be over. So now it's different, and right now it is our advice to us, to all of those enterprises which depend on Belarusian products, to rethink their supply chains in order not to be dependent on them and not to depend on the development in the security sector. So that's a situation that is totally normal, and as you can see, as example with the Russian Federation, we can see that some trade is still going on because there are certain changes which are very difficult to untie in practice. I mean, politically it seems easy, but in real life it's very difficult. So in this situation, there is the issue of long-term problems, and this is something that needs to be taken into account by every manufacturer or producer that we have. We have a separate law on sanctions, we have a separate law on economic sanctions, and separately we have trade policy. Okay, so you advised us to avoid hype, but I'll try to do that. So there is a Council of Exporters under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then a similar body under the Ministry of Minister of Economy, and a similar body under the Office of the President. Isn't it similar to that famous saying where too many people care for one thing with no result? Okay, so if you've been working in this area for some time, you'll understand that 95% of the membership is identical. We all know our exporters, our investors, we know them for many years, we know how people are joining and leaving. Olga and me are well aware of this, and thus we do not have contradictions. We have the same people in the Exporters Council as the ones in the Council on International Trade, etc., etc. So in the meetings with business, we see the same companies. The issue is that this dialogue is peculiar because they need daily support for many years. This is the main part of the story, and it's not because, well, let's say we have our fantastic company, AgroFusion, with the tomato products. It's not about, one-time support with selling of the large batch of their products. No, they need long-term policy with removing the tariff barriers, establishing commercial ties, etc. And speaking of the large machine building industry, such as the construction of railway cars or the energy machine building, etc., for them any contract is about 4 or 5 years of work, and at the governmental level has to be involved. So the approach here is not to be in the form of having different meetings with the different councils. No, we are in fact working in the same circle of people, and so we are doing it systematically. Wouldn't it make more sense to have just one body of this case? Why? For the sake of beauty, you mean? Well, look at this. I do support what Taras has mentioned, but again, it's not a matter of making us enemies of a kind. So yes, we have also the public councils, and this is representing the part of the Ukrainian business which is active, whether already present on the international markets or want to be there in 2 or 3 years, having assessed the capabilities of the Ukrainian market, and they do understand that the capacities of this market are limited and there are demographic changes, etc., etc. So they need to look for external markets, and thus they work with all the central authorities, they work in the regions, they are active, and they are working with oblast administrations such as in Lviv. They are getting additional investments, they are promoting their local companies at the external markets. How can we possibly put all this together? And coming back to the issues of decentralization, every council you're mentioning, it is involved at some point, and it has its certain focus of attention. Some things are done by us together, but some of the tasks are separate. The trade attaché, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Trade Ministry, all of them are separate to some extent. Yes, and let us be absolutely honest here, from the bureaucratic standpoint, it is best to be the monopolist, to have just one institution of your kind, but then all the questions and issues are being directed at you. So this defines to which extent we need to centralize our external policy, and there always will be some point in which the issue will arise. So there is a Ministry of Energy which is involved in the energy trade, and right now my function as a trade attaché is important for the Ministry of Energy and vice versa, and the same can be true for the Ministry of Agricultural Policy and the Ministry of Infrastructure, that it's very important for the transportation of those goods. And it cannot be too centralized, because there is a diplomacy of vice prime ministers, of the ministers, of the ambassadors, which I mean, every one of them can be assessed at the individual level. So the more entry points the business has, the more convenient it feels, because they are not dependent anymore on just one particular person like me, who then needs to talk to all the ministers. Such approach is good when getting an administrative services, but in order to create this narrative, the more of such entry points one has, the better it is. And here in this room we have all of the business associations, and again their composition is similar to a large extent, but there needs to be this possibility of democracy. And coming back to the political narratives, what is good in our trade is the fact that it is decentralized and that it is autonomous, because not much depends on the government, and a lot depends on the commercial activity of our enterprises. And it is very democratic, because we need to establish consensus. Our external trade and our economic diplomacy depends on what is established inside. What is established in the Agricultural Committee quite often defines much more than the efforts on the promotion of the products. If we have the laws that ensure the control and traceability of the products, it's easier to sell those products on the external markets. And if we don't have that, it creates difficulties. So this democratic approach is our advantage, whatever it may seem. And the Russian journalists, the opposition journalists used to ask us questions about how we deal with this, but this is exactly how we have it. This ongoing discussion is moving us forward. This is our competitive advantage. Yes. So our competitive advantage is have our team of folks. Okay, and I have one more question to Olga. Can we assess the work of the Ukrainian ambassadors by the number of signed agreements or the amounts of investments? Can this be a criteria? Well, this can be one of the factors for the assessment of the work of the ambassadors, and in the follow-up of what my colleague has said here, any agreement on the macro level or the contracts between some particular companies, it can take several years. If you speak of the Chinese market, it can be lasting 3 years or more. And unfortunately, we don't have Yuri Lutsenko with us, but he could tell us about the access to the Japanese market, and again it takes at least several years, but it can take 90 years. So it's very difficult to speak of the ambassadors being assessed by the number of agreements signed, the bilateral or multilateral agreements, because it takes lots of time. So surely this can be and should be an important part of work of our diplomatic platforms abroad, and I have always mentioned that they have to be strengthened economically and agriculturally, especially in the regions which are important buyers of our agricultural products. But these numbers, these trade missions, the participation of trade shows, that's not necessarily the only criterion. Yes, it's a pity we don't have Yuri with us. I wish we had him. I wish we had this opportunity to hear his reports from the field. But we have Gleb with us, and we can hear right now his expert opinion about the changes that Ukraine's trade policy needs and what changes need to be made. Please. So, yeah, I'll speak of the changes that the Ukrainian business needs, and Taras has mentioned that it's not only about exports, and quite often we have the problem with the fact that there is a market but there are no products to export there. And indeed, the exports are growing quite fast from 2017. We already have some good forecasts for this year, but we were simply fortunate with the prices. And we would like to export more goods with higher added value, higher exports of the more advanced products, and there is this opportunity which has been discussed for many years, the possibility of nearshoring, bringing the manufacturers closer to the markets, and in our case it's about the European Union. So this subject was developed especially in the aftermath of the COVID-19. But right now it's gaining traction once again because the logistics is becoming increasingly expensive, and we do not see a clear scenario of how these prices will go down. So in order to use these opportunities, the opportunities we have now, we need first and foremost investments. That's a subject of its own. We understand that there is a lack of investments in comparison with Poland, our benchmark that many people see it as a benchmark. Last year we could see only 15% of the necessary investments, or even lower than that. And tactically speaking, something that Taras has discussed already, that's the movement to the transborder and to integration with the European Union. And the colleagues are having surveys with exporters and importers. We could see that 68% of exporters are having challenges with the delays on the borders. And I also could hear from the German business that when we had meetings with them, they said that they need to follow the just-in-time model, and these delays that have to be there because we cannot use the sea transport here. We have to use the land borders, and this entails the risks of trade cooperation, and this quite often limits the investments because people need to start working together, then they see the needs in investment, and then they provide investments. That's how it works. So there are three different tasks here. The work with the neighbors. We have a couple of neighbors. One of them is greater, some of them are smaller. So these are our friends, so to speak. Poland is a good example of that. So on the one hand, it supports us geopolitically. On the other hand, it also is also blocking the permits for international transportation, and also in combination with the aggressive politics of Poland concerning the Ukrainian labor market, it looks like being rather unfriendly under the pretext of this positivity, and actually taking away the human resources from Ukraine. So here is a message to the international investors: let you work in Rzeszów instead of Drohobych, and we will provide Ukrainians to do that.
And actually, that's not just about increased exports to the EU, but also about increasing exports of commodities with more added value. Then, as mentioned, speeding up integration with the EU, but there is the clear roadmap. But I believe that another important aspect, and it has been discussed in the expert community, this is about the next steps after what Taras has mentioned. Whether it would be a good option to think about customs union and creating the joint market of goods and services without waiting for all the liberties that we may have there and full political integration, because there are different opinions whether we need to stick to trade sovereignty or have better access via removing that physical obstacle. However, of course, any kind of approximation is gives positive signal to investors. And as mentioned, looking for investors, because as I mentioned, this is the greatest gap lack in Ukraine. And I believe that we need to speak about both economic and cultural democracy as well as other modalities. Even yesterday we discussed it in the office, and I'm grateful to colleagues from New Europe who sent us the data of this survey. And last year we worked on the theme of the corrosive Chinese capital, and for me it was very significant that there was this question: if there is an opposition between the US and China, who are you going to support? And while in globally there is this discussion that the US and China are now quite comparable, on the other hand, in Ukraine, well, in contrast to Russia, China has not been attacking us, it is not aggressive to us, so we still see this huge gap. And I believe it is about cultural diplomacy, because we don't see China in Ukraine, even though it's a great country with great history. It's not that I'm giving advice to the Chinese colleagues, but this is an example where with moderate efforts you can develop positive image of the country, above all for the sake of investment. Because when you hold the investment conference and nice presentations there, this is not sufficient, especially under the negative background created consciously, on purpose, intentionally by Russia. Investing into the country that may be under attack at any moment, well, that gives investors a lot of doubts, and we need to work there. Okay, so we mentioned that we regretted that Mr. Lutsenko was not with us, but he has joined us now. So we are looking forward to your feedback as a business representative. How efficient is work of Ukrainian diplomats promoting the Ukrainian exports? What should be changed, if anything? Good afternoon. Sorry for being late, and thank you for inviting me. I welcome all the speakers, especially Olga. I understand that you have already announced your appointment, your position, so our diplomacy is definitely going to be enhanced due to Olga's efforts, because she's very good expert of agribusiness, food processing, and a number of other areas. So, speaking about my vision, how diplomacy may work with businesses. I believe that in the markets where Ukraine is not well known, synergy of diplomacy and businesses would be the only way to achieve success, to succeed. Where people don't know about us, diplomats are perceived regularly, they have a high reputation. And I've just come back, I talked to the CEO club, I talked to business persons, and they asked me, do they take money? Do they take bribes, meaning diplomats? Who can we engage there in other countries so that they helped us address some issues? Well, our company, it mostly works with Japan, and we have very good experience of cooperation with the Embassy of Ukraine to Japan. And we could compare. We had the experience of working with Germany, and this is the human factor that is key to success. If the ambassador is a driver, if he or she is inspired, experienced, and energetic, as in our Tokyo embassy in Tokyo, well, then everything will be cool. There will be the synergy and resources, even though all the embassies have very limited resources if we speak about trade and support for trade. So sometimes it is rather unfocused and fragmented, but if there is an ambassador who sees that as a priority and who allocates this limited human resources in order to fight the due battles, then that will be good for the businesses. Synergy of diplomacy and businesses. What's the existential role of it? Diplomats are seen as strategic representatives of the state. It's not about those who just jump on something and then step back. So if an ambassador comes to the meeting, for importers, that's already a ticked box. It means that everything that they invest into, that's going to be to pay back in long term. So if our diplomats work together with business persons, it means that there will be contracts, so the chances are high that there will be the contracts and supplies, etc. And actually now the situation for food and agribusiness is cool. Well, we only deal with food and agribusinesses, so that's what I'm speaking about. Increased prices on ingredients. This is the factor that puts Ukraine in the position where it is seen, where its added value becomes obvious, because our price has always been a bit lower, but the value of our products might have been even lower. Now, because of these perturbations, Ukraine acts as the most demanded partner. There is the highest demand. And now I see significant interest by the Japanese embassy and the counterparts in Japan. So I received a call from the Japanese embassy with the questions which categories to focus on, what the problems are. And there I say, in order to enter the Japanese market, there is support from USAID, EBRD, from the Canadian government, from Israel, not from Japanese. But now something has happened. And this is something that needs to be that we need to jump on this opportunity. This is not so much about price fluctuations, but it is about that if now diplomats double or triple their efforts, then we will be able to build on that and not to lose these positive dynamics which were caused by COVID situation. I don't know what happens in other markets, but we definitely feel that Japan, it is so far away. And the container before COVID, to send a container, it was $2,000, and now it is $11,000. So you can hardly imagine how it works, but now it is something that we need to make use of. So the respective value of Ukrainian products, commodities, has gone up, and here diplomacy contributes a lot, because then it is something that makes initiatives look not as opportunism or just a short-term strategy to earn money, but this is a long-term strategy and policy of the state. Okay, we are running out of time, and I suggest that Olga maybe wraps up, or otherwise you could tell us about your objectives for the first year of work, and after a year we will go back to that. Yes, I do know that you will go back to that. So I would like to really wrap up. So I like it that I believe our panel discussion was a true synergy, and that's nice because I believe that this is a good example where various ministries and businesses and expert community speak the same language, and there has been no fight. Yes, that's true, because often we start showing fingers at each other as kids do in kindergartens. Okay, so we speak about the same priorities, the same things, and we have a very much aligned vision, and that's cool. That's, by the way, very important for me too, because when you ask me about my plans, and of course the minister will be judged based on KPIs, certain KPIs at the Council Board of Exporters and Investors. I believe that that will be helpful because there are these businesses that work on the ground and they understand long-term objectives, and they plan how to be profitable because business is about profitability. So they strategize how to move on, how to do that, and then this information will be conveyed via the board, via MFA, via diplomats in Ukraine and the Ministry of Economic Development, so the trade representative. And then I'm sure that the priorities that are raised or set by the sectoral ministry, line ministry, as presented by Minister Kuleba, who spoke about those aspects that on the regional, global, bilateral level are seen as important priorities for Ukraine, then they will be achieved. So maybe with this positive statement, we can wrap up. Let's do that. And thank you for being with us. And we see that the year 2022 may become a true breakthrough in the context of diplomatic activities and foreign trade. Let's hope so.